Is your team not performing well? Is morale low and turnover high? Are you falling further behind the competition? I'm here to help. I'm your host, Shani, and this is the Leadership Show, where business strategy and culture finally meet, and we make the long-awaited shift from rhetoric to results. I promise I'm not your typical boring leadership consultant, and I will help you get your shift together. Let's do this. Hello, Leadershifters, and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Show with yours truly, Shani. I am super excited to get into a discussion with today's guest, who is Ginny Clarke, joining us from the San Francisco Bay Area today, bright and early in the morning. I just want to say props for a 7:30 call time for a podcast. You are a rock star, not just because you're an early riser. Folks, you're going to want to listen in today because Ginny is an extremely experienced executive recruiter. She has worked for big firms like Spencer Stuart. She's done her own thing. She currently works in-house at Google as the director of leadership staffing, meaning she helps Google recruit all the senior most positions. She is also the author of a book called Career Mapping. And we are going to tackle some of those topics with a lens today, given what's happening in the world. And we want this to keep happening in the world. We don't want it to just be a blip, as it has been in the past, on diversity recruiting, and not just recruiting, but keeping diversity in the workplace. And that starts before recruiting and goes deep into the cultural recesses of an organization. So with that extensive introduction, Ginny, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, Shani, thank you. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Excellent. So let's just get right into it. What does it mean to be a specialist, in particular in diversity recruiting?
Let me explain something, because I think a lot of people don't understand this. They think maybe because I'm Black, I know a lot of other Black people and a lot of other underrepresented individuals. And
right. And like many things, that would be a naive way to look at it.
It's very naive.
Yeah.
I spent a number of years in financial services after I went to business school. I had been a college recruiter coming out of undergrad at University of California, Davis. And then I hit this critical point in my career where my father died, and I wanted to really figure out what I wanted to do because I wasn't loving being in the commercial real estate industry at the time. And I thought back, left breadcrumbs for myself, as I say in the book. I always loved recruiting. I always loved going on campus, and I had done that for all the companies I ever worked for, even though that wasn't my job. So I love assessing people. I love understanding business issues. And that's really what executive level recruiting is. And so I networked my way into one of the world's largest executive search firms, as you mentioned, Spencer Stuart. And
creme de la creme, baby.
Yeah. Before I did anything as it related to diversity, I learned how to do executive level recruiting. There's an art and a science. There's a very clear methodology. People tend to think, well, you just go in your Rolodex, you see who you know, you build a network, and you throw them at your clients. It couldn't be farther from the truth.
Right.
It's quite a thoughtful, methodical approach. And so before, I've had to remind people this because they look at me, again, as a Black woman and go, oh, diversity, yeah, cool, you. And I'm like, actually, no, I could run circles around you in terms of just executive recruiting. I understand. And that was the foundation for me to really understand, how does this work? What are the nuances? What are the impediments?
Yeah.
Why is it that more search firms aren't tapping and placing underrepresented individuals? And we can get into why that is. But what is the diversity piece? It's the fact that I understood process, and I know how to identify individuals in the market better than other folks. I'm more resourceful. I'm better networked in many ways. So let's get clear. It's executive level recruiting first, understanding all of the impediments, the nuances, and then you can start going into the market once you understand what the objectives are.
Absolutely. And also, let's be clear that diversity isn't just people of color, right?
No,
It's gender, sexual preference, religion, birthplace of origin,
people with
Probably one of the most
disabilities,
important
veterans.
pieces is mindset and filter, like
Mhm.
how we think, how we make decisions, right? And that is what makes you, like, and to me, that's what I was thinking when I asked, what does it mean to be a diversity
Yeah,
recruiter? Meaning, like, because you see the full picture of a person, not just what their resume says in terms of
that's
where they
right.
worked. Oh, great, you know, that's a brand name firm, and oh, it's a woman, check. Oh, it's a brown person, check. That all that is superficial.
Thank you. Yeah, and at the core of what I have always been espousing is competencies. And competencies to me, they're those things that are portable. They're those things that allowed me to transition across industries like 5 different times and across roles and functions 6 or 7 different times. And what I was able to do sort of instinctively was to build a narrative for people and help them connect the dots to
Yep.
say, okay, I don't necessarily have experience doing this thing, but I do have a set of competencies that I have developed by virtue of some of experiences and some of which are innate for me. So those are the
Absolutely.
things that I'm looking for in people. Those are the things that I talk about in my book relative to an individual really needing to understand those things if they're looking for a job and as they're managing their career. But to me, that is like the most integral ingredient for assessing talent. And it's got to be that. It can't be just based on where you've worked and who you know and what schools you went to, because I've met some brilliant people who went to San Jose State and I met some serious duds who went to Harvard. So we can't use that as a predictor of success.
Absolutely. And, you know, I just want to share a quick story with you along those lines. When I was a junior person at Goldman Sachs, had come in as an analyst, there were, you know, it's mostly Ivy League and many, you know, whatever the East Coast liberal arts schools that are considered Ivy League-esque. That's where they do the preponderance of their recruiting.
Right.
But then there was me from the University of Miami, and there were a few other people from state schools. There was a guy I worked with from University of Illinois and what have you. And they had such high expectations of the folks from Harvard and Stanford and Duke and, you know, whatever. And not to say that all of those people weren't successful, a lot of them were, but making the assumption that they were going to be more successful than people who came from a private but not Ivy League school like Miami or a public state school couldn't have been further from the truth. And, you know, and it's like, as those of us, we had to work harder almost to prove ourselves. And once we did, the mindsets of some of the people who were actively recruiting, even in the HR function, were changed. And I felt really good about helping them change that mindset, because they were like, you know what, like, you work your ass off, and we need to hire more people like you who are scrappy. And what's the word today that they use and there's even a book, grit. We had grit.
Oh, grit, yes.
Right, that's a thing today, right? Yep. Like, we had grit before we knew grit was a thing.
That's right.
And that's what made us successful, because we had competencies like tenacity and not being entitled that some of the other people didn't have.
That's right. Thank you. That's so true. Now, just to pivot, and you might not be ready to go here, but I'll take us here for just a second, because you're talking about sort of some of these underdogs, right? In that, in the Goldman Sachs example, layer in being African American or Latino or, you know, some other difference. But I'm bringing up Black in particular because of the historical discriminatory behavior that's been exhibited in this country. And so in my case, yes, I'm a fair-skinned Black woman. People even have said things like, oh, you have green eyes, you're not really Black. And I'm just like, wow, now that's downright ignorant, okay?
Well, I get the you don't look Jewish thing all the time, so I sort of get it, but yeah.
Right. So, I mean, but at the end of the day, people would see me and wonder if I wasn't where I was by virtue of some special program, right? I show up, I'm 6 feet tall. I unnerve people with my height sometimes. So I spent a lot of my life trying to make other people comfortable, but still I need to show up as ever more competent, because there is this, as George Bush once said, and the only time I quote him, soft bigotry of low expectations, where, you know, people look at you and kind of go, oh, you're here, that's great. But actually expect as much from you.
Ugh.
So yeah, there's all kinds of, micro and macro aggressions that still exist in the workplace for folks.
Yeah. I'm going to go out on a limb and ask you a provocative question. What's the worst micro or macro aggression you've ever faced in your career?
There have been quite a few. And you know what, I've kind of stuffed a lot of them down, but something that came to my memory more recently was, and I'll say where I was at the time, and it's not an indictment against this firm, but I was at Spencer Stuart. I was a partner. I was having a meeting with a more junior recruiter who happened to be Latino and a researcher who was Filipina. And we were talking about financial services. We were all in the financial services practice. And so we were in a huddle room and that's what we were talking about. Mm-hmm. And one of my colleagues walked by and stuck his head in and said, "Hey, what is this, a conspiracy?"
And he thought he was being funny.
He thought he was being funny. I was so stunned. I frankly don't even remember what I said in the moment. But I did go to my office manager. We were at an offsite a few days later, and I told him about the incident. And I said I didn't want to name the individual. I was really trying to point out to him that this is evident in the culture, and we need to be aware of this. And he pressed me to get the name of the person, and I finally gave it up. And he goes, "Oh, like, oh, well, we know."
We know about him already. Like, we haven't done shit about it, but we know about him already.
So yeah, but it told me what I needed to know in terms of dealing with him or not, and setting my expectations for how I would be treated, even though I was a peer to him in the organizational structure. He somehow felt superior, and in his own mind said that, but it was clearly and completely inappropriate.
Absolutely. And, I of course didn't mean to make you feel uncomfortable. The reason I'm asking is because I want people who are listening and watching to understand what it looks like, and I think the more examples that unwitting, in that case, he may not have been unwitting. I think a lot of people are unwitting and they say things and I think it's important for us to point them out. Absolutely. Whether it's the person who felt the offense, who gives the feedback, or someone who witnessed it. I think anybody can step up and give the person feedback and be like, "Hey, I know you probably didn't mean this. Here's the impact of your words on me, just so you know for future reference." Yeah. People don't know what they don't know, and part of it is
and
programming.
In that case, I recall that I did approach the guy after I composed myself, like later on that day, I did go on and say something directly to him, and I got the usual, I was just trying to be funny. I knew better. Yeah.
Right, and that's the thing. Like, and the guy like that, if he doesn't understand that it wasn't funny after you told him it wasn't fucking funny,
that's right.
Like, then he's got work to do. I think a lot of people would be like mortified. Right, to hear that that they unwittingly committed an aggression like that.
He didn't seem that upset, actually. Yeah.
So
which told me everything. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So he gets the Heisman now.
The stiff arm. That's right.
Yeah. So I have football on my mind because I am doing day 1 of a 3-part virtual leadership retreat later this afternoon. And one of our icebreakers for today was I asked everyone to show up in a t-shirt or a jersey from their favorite sports team.
Oh,
and nice. Of course, mine's going to be University of Miami football. So I have football on the brain.
Nice. I love that. Fun.
All right. So let's talk about these competencies, because that is the key to identifying great talent of any shape, size,
That's right.
etc. So what's the best way that you would advise a leader to suss that out?
Yeah. At Google and at Spencer Stuart and every place I've ever worked in my book, I really tried to articulate and come up with a list. Google, we have a list of, I think there are as many as 19 different competencies, and we don't expect people to have every single one, but we want, for example, the hiring manager, the leader, to be able to say there are 4 or 5 that are non-negotiable. that are 4 or 5 that are table stakes that anybody I bring in my
Yep.
organization is going to have. But then there are another 4 or 5 that are unique to this role where I need this individual to be able to offer me proof points. Competencies are about behaviors. So
Yep.
so people tend to think it's interchangeable with skills, and skills, yeah, that's fine. But I think skills are a little bit more discrete. You know, you can have a skill as a welder, that's your skill. And
Yes.
arguably there's a competency, but I'm looking for things that are a little less tangible here so that we can really, think of them as deconstructed elements of things that you have done. So for example, one of the leadership competencies that we talk about is operating in ambiguity, you know, aspects of problem solving. We want to know how people think. What would you do in this situation? There are hypothetical scenarios that we would offer during an interview, or give me an example of a time when you had to confront XYZ, not just did you do it, right?
Absolutely.
So those are just a couple things that, you know, we're real intentional about, and even to the point of arming the other panel interviewers, because someone comes in at the senior level, they're going to meet with 4, 5, 6, however many people over time, and we give the interviewers questions, these competency-based questions, so that everybody is getting feedback that is as objective as possible to be able to make the most objective decision.
Right. So what it sounds like you're saying is behavioral-based interviewing with targeting specific competencies and getting them to tell you, and getting people to tell you about their experiences or what they would do so that it shows you how they think is so much more important than, you know, are you a team player? Well, of course, everyone's going to say yes. It's like, no, tell me about a time you ran a team that had conflict. How did you handle it? Or, you know, whatever.
Yeah, competence, you just said the key word. It's a small word, and I don't know if you realize that you said it. It's how. That's what I want to know. And when I also lead and created an internal mobility program for Google senior leaders. When I started, I was brought in to lead diversity, and then they said, would you create this internal mobility program, which means I'm helping certain senior leaders find other roles within Google. And as part of that, my team and I will essentially coach them on, you know, let's look at your relationships. Let's look at, before we're putting them with other recruiters and other leaders to explore particular opportunities, we want to make sure that their narrative is tight, because a lot of them might have been here for a while and they don't really know how to talk about themselves in a way that is constructive. It's like, oh, well, they know me. It's like, nah, you're actually competing with external talent. So you might want to allow us to work with you. And it's been so gratifying to see so many of them kind of go, oh, it's the how. That's what you're wanting me to tell you, not just that I did it, right?
And setting them up for success with the people so that the people in their new role don't go, oh gosh, he's from, you know, whatever functional area, or, you know, he's from X, he can never work out here, you know, in the real world.
Or conversely, oh, I know him and, you know, I think he's a good guy, so let's bring him on over. And it doesn't work because he actually doesn't have the real competencies to do the role, you know, especially in the senior ranks. We tend to think people are a little bit more fungible. You know, if somebody's a general manager, and that can work really well, certain people have those capabilities. At Google, for example, we tend to be a lot more siloed. We tend to like specialists and domain experts who are narrow and deep. So it can be hard to convince somebody that you have the range to go across a couple of different domain areas. And so these competencies can help bridge that gap. And I think the onus is on the individual to convince the hiring manager that they have those competencies.
Yes. And you know, I want to just take a little detour off of something you just said, and then get back on track, which is the narrow and deep versus broad. Just love your opinion on that, because that's actually something I talk to clients about a lot, especially those who are considering or in the process of changing careers. And there was an article, I want to say in the New York Times late last year, are you a tiger or a Roger? meaning Roger Federer, Tiger Woods, and it
Ah,
was Tiger Woods grew, like from the time, like before he could walk, he had a golf club in his hand, and that's all he ever did, narrow and deep golf, versus Roger Federer was a broader based athlete before he decided to pursue tennis. So I've used that, are you a Roger or a Tiger? Just in your role, what is one better than another, or does it depend?
I think organizations need both.
Okay.
But I think each organization should be deliberate about when they're structuring it, what are they looking for? Particularly at the higher up you go, to me, the broader you need to be. And I think a lot of companies suffer from having domain experts become leaders because they're domain experts.
Yep.
But they've neglected a big chunk of the capability set or competency set, which is leadership. It's almost assumed, well, you're such a deep subject matter expert, you're so smart, surely you can figure this leadership thing out. And I think that is just ridiculous.
Yeah,
okay?
it is.
It's risky. I think, you're setting yourself up for difficulty by not having super strong leadership. So the breadth that I'm talking about is really around those leadership capabilities in addition to subject matter expertise. Now, to the extent that you're going for even broader general management capabilities, again, I think that there's plenty of room for that. I like to, my concern, I'm going to flip it a little bit, because I want to make sure that an organization is optimizing the people that it has. And
Okay.
I think you're leaving money on the table, quite literally, to the extent that companies haven't done thorough enough talent reviews to know that an individual, and again, I'm talking at the senior levels, so the numbers aren't huge, but at Google, there's 4,000 senior leaders out of 120,000 people. That sounds like a big number, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small elite group. We should know, we should be doing succession planning. We should be doing talent reviews for all of those folks to be able to say, this one needs development to get greater breadth, to be more of service to the company, and importantly, to address that individual's goals and objectives, right? Maybe they don't want to be too much of a generalist. They want to stay narrow. You've got a lot of engineers and technical folks who love that narrowness. Keep them doing that. Are they ready to be real broad leaders in that narrow band? Fine. If not, make them an individual contributor, but understand what the capabilities are and the expectations as they align with the needs of the organization.
Absolutely. Gosh, it like needs to be a Venn diagram of, what the company needs, what the individual is good at, and what they want to develop. And
That's
the
right.
sweet spot is in the middle. And I think too many companies just say, oh, well, we need to move a chess piece here, and this person gets pretty good reviews, we're just going to move them to Tokyo, or
That's right.
whatever.
Yeah. And it's not done deliberately. I mean, we use, I'll name a name, we use Korn Ferry as one of our partners in doing assessment work. And we have someone who used to work there on our staff at Google, who is, an IO psychologist, who really understands and can dig in on what are the organizational needs and how are we assessing these individuals in a really, really rigorous way.
Yep. And actually, I was going to ask that question. So good. Now we're getting kind of back on track with the assessment thing. Thank you.
Yeah.
What would you recommend to, big companies like Google can afford to hire the Korn Ferries of the world. Small, medium-sized businesses, not necessarily. Are there any assessments that you really like in your experience that you think those companies can use in their talent management process?
I'm not good. I'll throw one out because I use this in my book for individuals. It's Strengthsfinders.
Yeah.
There are a bunch of them out there. Find one that seems to resonate with the nature of your business and use it. Strengthsfinders has a library of, I think, 35 different strengths. They align with competencies. They're synonymous, I think, in this case.
Absolutely.
I don't know that they're as granular for particular functions as you want them to be. I think they're more psychometric. I'm not, I'm not a psychologist either, but
Yep.
so I would ask around and see what you're looking for. But I think the main thing is there are plenty of, I'm forgetting the institute, Center for Learning. There are lots of corporate resources out there for small to medium-sized businesses to be able to get their hands on this stuff. I mean, literally, you could Google it, and you would be able to find. I know it's such a
It's
verb,
so cool
right?
to work at Google and tell people to Google it.
Well, I'm just lucky that my little home device over here didn't just say, "Can I help you?"
I know, it's so true. Hey Google, hey Alexa, hey Siri. I know. Anytime you meet someone with those names.
Oh, see? Yep.
So funny. All right, so now let's bookend this process we've been talking about of recruiting and talent management and so forth. On the one hand, we got to look before that, right? At where does diversity, again, not just of people of color, but diversity of thought, diversity of everything, where does that fall in the fabric of the culture? Is it in the C-suite, or is it like a low-level HR or mid-level HR function? And so, yeah, I love the look I'm getting, because I know we're going to have a juicy conversation. So, I guess maybe let's put it in the context of, where does a chief diversity officer really belong in an organization, and how can that help companies really take this more seriously than they have in the past?
Yeah, I've done a lot of chief diversity officer searches, and I know a lot of people who serve in that role. And I know and admire and very close to Google's chief diversity officer. So I think I'm going to be a little provocative here. I think that regardless of the individual, right? So this is, please hear me, this is not an indictment against any one person or the role itself.
Okay.
My concern is that in many organizations, the C-suite uses that function, that role, that office or center of excellence as a crutch, and arguably with HR. I mean, because a lot of those chief diversity officer roles report in through human resources. Sometimes there's a direct report relationship into the CEO or the COO. And, all those things are fine. I mean, you can argue that, oh, well, I have access to the CEO, and so, it's embedded. The structure doesn't matter unless leadership is walking the walk. And I fear that people are falling back on this term of culture, and it becomes this disembodied entity that no one is actually responsible for. And so I just want to make sure, regardless of where that chief diversity officer is sitting, that they understand what the true levers are, meaning who are the most important individuals in an organization, what are their behaviors, and they're able to influence some of their behaviors. That's what a culture is. It's an amalgam of the behaviors of the leaders of the organization. So you can walk around and say, we have this wonderful culture where everybody is respectful and loves each other. But if you've got people in your organization who are doing not so cool things, saying not so cool things to people, then you're kidding yourself. You're in denial about this culture, because the culture is you.
Yeah, and all it takes is one employee. All it takes was one barista at a Starbucks to deny the bathroom, right, to a Black patron, and it exposed, right, an entire culture. And then they are still actually paying for that, if you will, and and trying to right the wrong, and all that sort of stuff. It just takes one person.
Yeah.
It's
but that act is symbolic of what is actually at the core of the culture. That's what that's what, people clutch their pearls like, oh my God, that happened here. It's like, yeah, I see it, hear it, observe it. I don't want to say daily, but frequently enough to know that, yes, there is this insidious culture. And I think it's comments like that former colleague from years ago made that you just have to stop. You got to call it out, and you can't allow, and at some point, someone, you don't tolerate it. They can't be in your organization. You
Yep.
say no, you you excise the cancer,
Yep.
right? You get rid of that toxicity.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another definition of culture that I like, is what leaders tolerate of themselves and others.
That's right.
And so companies that, the CEO gets caught like doing something like, and the companies that are like, oh, no, out, like they're making a statement. They're like, we're not going to tolerate this at the CEO level. And so we're not going to tolerate it at the IC level anywhere.
Isn't it a little amusing to you now that we're seeing a rash of those kinds of actions by companies? They're getting rid of this person or that person that does something wrong. It's like they've been here for 20 years and all of a sudden they've been behaving this way and now you're getting called out, you're on blast, so you're going to act. Okay, all right, cool.
Well, that's kind of the difference between some people and others, is that some people got caught and others didn't, or just the mindsets.
Yeah.
I want to say finally shifting. Let's hope it's shifting, like I said at the very beginning, more long term rather than, this is another flavor of the month.
Yeah.
Type of anti-racism wave.
It's early. It's early to tell, but the conversations are different, and I'm relentless within Google of saying, look systemically. Don't make this a knee-jerk reaction.
Yep.
Let me explain why this has been happening. You need to understand why before you start trying to throw a solution at it, right? Understand the history, understand the root causes of why this has been tolerated for so long and why you were complicit in it. And this isn't about shame, but this is about, if we're all smart people trying to fix a problem, then let's start by analyzing it for all that it is, no matter how uncomfortable that might make you.
Yes, absolutely. And speaking of analyzing, that's a good segue to, like, whether it's run out of the chief diversity officer's office or somebody else, like, how about a needs analysis first, before we have it, before we just say, oh, we need a better diversity strategy. Like,
no. And
first,
you know
right?
what? Yeah. And I'm writing something for my own podcast right now as kind of interrupting the regular programming, because I'm so compelled to talk more about this stuff. And one of the things I'm really calling out is, listen, this needs to be embedded. This really, so you can rely on the chief diversity officer to hold people accountable, but the actual individual who needs to be, that everyone should be accountable to, is to the CEO and to shareholders. And to whoever the rest of the stakeholders are for that particular organization. You can't just, you can't dismiss this. You can't shove it at somebody else and say, this is your problem, go fix it. This is not in isolation. This cuts very deep, and each individual needs to be confronting themselves on the most profound levels. This is personal, this is emotional. This is not a fix it, throw money at it, and it'll be done next quarter or even in 2 years or 5 years. This is, I'm going to behave differently because I have a different understanding about myself in the world and other people in the world.
Yeah. And that it takes practice, it takes commitment, and I liken it to health. Like, if you suddenly find out you have type 2 diabetes, well, you need to change your diet, you need to change your exercise, you need to probably take some supplements. Until you get it under control, you're going to have to needle stick yourself every day and get your sugar levels, right? And those changes don't happen overnight. You don't suddenly get diagnosed and say, okay, like, I'm suddenly going to do the paleo diet, even though I used to eat Captain Crunch for breakfast, a big Subway for lunch, and, steak frite for dinner, right? Like, so, like, if I want people to take the scariness away from it and look at it like any other change they need to make. Like, recognize where they're off track, right? Oh, I recognize I was eating like shit. Okay, so I recognize that I was committing micro and or macro aggressions. I recognize that I don't know what it's like to to walk around with, you know, an identifying skin color that, you know, makes me different. I recognize that, blah, blah, right?
That's right.
And stop taking the shame out of it, or the embarrassment, or the difficult conversations out of it, and look at it like another change.
Well, and it's funny because I think there's this sort of deflection where it's like, you're making me feel so terrible. It's like, wait a minute, this isn't about
Yeah.
you. Let's bring it back to me. And do I have anger and resentment? I'm not gonna lie, I do. And it came up for me as in the wake of protests in a
Sure.
way that I didn't even foresee, right? I mean, I literally was watching a video one morning shortly after George Floyd was killed, and all of a sudden something came up from like the depths of my like root chakra area, for those people who know that kind of energetic space. And I just burst into tears. There was just all this pain and rage from decades of having observed this. I mean, my great grandfather was a slave. My mother worked and grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama. My grandfather walked from Georgia to Mississippi to learn under Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver. And so this is in my lineage. I've been to segregated places as a kid, you know, so people tend to think, oh, we're here, or you, Ginny, you've achieved so much and you have a nice lifestyle and you're educated and you have a great job and you're influencer. Yeah, and this is where I come from and this is what I've had to put up with to get here. And I'm not trying to shame you again, but I want you to understand and not out of guilt. And now don't just sort of whipsaw and say, oh, well, then let me hire you, you know?
Yeah.
Just to assuage your guilt. That's not useful to me. That's not what I'm looking for. What I really want is for people to begin to appreciate, for example, and this is where I heard myself sort of connecting some of these dots. So if we all agree that there has been systemic, institutionalized racism and discrimination against Black people in this country, and we now acknowledge that, for some people are acknowledged this, there's a subset, a minority, I'm hoping, that don't believe that Black people are equal. But if most rational people understand that Black people are indeed equal in the eyes of God, biologically, intellectually, there's nothing inferior about our Constitution. And in fact, if you think about what we've been through, you might argue that we're pretty damn resilient, right?
Yep.
So all those things being said, now you look into a corporate construct and you look at the Black individuals who are in those organizations. Might it stand to reason that we haven't gotten as far because of these inequities that are so systemic, and that we might deserve to be looked at? I'm not saying be promoted rapidly against everybody else. I'm never going to purport and suggest, sort of reverse discrimination. But what I am saying, look at us through a different lens. Now that you're acknowledging it on a social level, bring that same acknowledgement into your organization and say, wow, you know, I've been holding you to a white norm, a white standard.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So look at me for all of who I am. And I'm not like you necessarily, but I'm as good as you.
Yeah.
Or even better, arguably, in some ways.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so that's the other end of the book end, or whatever, is, okay, so, you know, culture starts with the CEO.
Yep.
Chief diversity officer can't be just window dressing, right?
No.
That's like first.
That's right.
And we've got recruiting by assessment, not just checking boxes, right? Okay, and then we've got the rest of the talent management process, which is, so what kind of development does somebody need because of what has happened historically to help them offset that? Is it presentation skills? Is it networking skills? Like, what is it,
or
right?
just a different manager, right? And this same talent assessment that I'm talking about, you should be doing that for everybody.
Of course.
And identifying the low performing leaders. Because if you're only assessing your leaders on the basis of what they have contributed to the bottom line, you are putting a lot of people at risk, because not all leaders are good managers. Not all managers are good leaders.
That's right.
So make the distinction between who's really leading well and managing their team well. What kinds of attrition rates are certain leaders seeing among, is there parity? Are people who are of majority leaving at the same rate as people who are underrepresented?
Yep.
And I can tell you in a lot of companies, there is not parity. You're seeing more people of color and women leaving at higher rates. Why is that?
Because we're
Right?
not getting promoted and paid as much as white men.
Well, and who's making that call at the compensation situations, right? At those
Yeah.
meetings, who's making that determination? This comes down to a person, right?
Yep.
Again, we talk in terms of what's systemic, but we're not rooting out some of those individual fire starters and those people who are part of that toxicity and that malignant element that are making this not work for everybody. And so do top grading. I've talked about this before, for the bottom performing, and it doesn't have to be subjective. These companies do surveys, right? There are performance ratings that everybody gets from their peers, 360. So you have information that's going to allow you, organizations, to rate your people. And so to the extent that you've got some chronic bad performers when it comes to people management, get rid of them.
100%.
I mean, you can put them through training, but how long is that going to take?
No.
And to the extent that they don't meet the expectations, are you going to dock their compensation? You should. If they don't have any diversity among their team, that's a problem. Look into that. And again, some of these things need to be tied to compensation.
Yes, I agree, because that's where the rubber meets the road. You hit people in their wallet and they're much more likely to make the change. Hold on, I'm just writing that down so I don't forget it in the summary. And then let's take it even further. Let's take it into like interfacing with customers and supply chain. Like, right? Do we have diversity in our supply chain? Do we have diversity in our sales force? Do we have diversity in our customer service arm, right? Like it
should be everywhere.
Like, not like I wrote about this the other day on social media. I'm like, diversity doesn't just live in HR. There needs to be attention paid in every functional area.
I sort of jokingly said, maybe we should just defund HR, and what I mean by that is just get rid of them for a minute and see what happens. Because I think a lot of leaders want to make that HR punt.
Yep.
Hey, you're up. Diversity, fix it. You guys fix it and call me when it's fixed.
Yeah. Well, that's a typical example of giving someone the responsibility, but not the authority.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
And that's part of why companies set HR up to fail when they give them big initiatives like this, because they don't have the authority to create the buy-in or to adjust compensation to penalize or reward or whatever the case may be.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not about the numbers. I want to reiterate that too, because I'm getting a lot of, well, what should we be measuring? And I want to see 2 Black people and 4 this, and let's count. And yeah, you have to count. I'm not saying you can't. You have to measure your progress, but it shouldn't be about, oh, I got another one, because frankly, to me, that feels like now I got a bounty on my head.
Right.
That's reminiscent of being chattel again.
Yeah. Being
on the auction block. That doesn't feel so good. If I know that that's why you want to hire me, that's downright offensive. And that's so companies need to walk a bit of a fine line right now, but it means that they need to really get a lot of people like some of these chief diversity officers and some of their strongest leaders. And by strong leaders, I mean those leaders who get it, who understand people. At the end of the day, that's all I'm looking for. I want leaders who are broad, who are self-aware enough, who are non-ego based, to be able to tap in and get people, all people. Those are the best leaders I've ever known. And I don't care where you're coming from, what your nationality is, what your race is, what your ethnicity, those things don't have to matter necessarily for you to have empathy, for you to be curious, for you to want to get to know who I am at my core. Those are the best leaders, and those are the ones that are going to have the most diverse teams and are going to be the most productive and the most effective. It's been proven time and time again. We know this, right? It's been for 25, 30 years, McKinsey and others have been writing about how, having diversity increases financial performance. And yet that's not enough of an incentive.
Right.
So now we've got, all this social pressure and everybody's clamoring to get it right. Yeah, you've had, quite a few decades to get it wrong. And so you're not going to turn on a dime, and you need to start listening to different people.
Yeah. And then, along with the diversity goes the psychological safety, which Google repopularized that term 5 or so years ago with Project Oxygen.
Yeah.
The best performing teams, what they all had in common was the presence of psychological safety, which means a lot of things. But to me, the headline of what it means is that people feel free to be themselves.
Yeah.
In all of their range, and even diversity within someone who isn't diverse, right?
Right.
Like that you can fly your freak flag at work and not feel like you're going to be penalized or taken off a project, or that sort of thing.
Maybe I'm a little old school, and I get it, because I do think that can be taken too far, right? That people will take liberties in what they'll say without regard for someone else. And that's why I use that word empathy, because you can fly your freak flag and say what you want to say, that's fine, but you are in a broader context. You're part of an ecosystem where you need to respect and honor other people's boundaries, right?
Yeah,
and I think
flag
sometimes
within a professional context. But too many people show up at work and feel like they have to act within a box of expectations. And, maybe they've got this super creative side that they're afraid to come out, or they're just afraid to voice an opinion that differs from their leaders because they have a unique experience and that sort of thing. Yeah, I don't mean freak flag in the sense of like, I'm
no, I wasn't taking it there. I know what you but I just want, because I think there are generational differences too, right? I'm well over 50. So I come from a different generation where the corporate environment was more rigid, let's face it. Coming to Google was wonderful, and seeing this open environment. At the same time, I see a lot of millennials who don't necessarily understand some of the what I consider to be just common sense boundaries, but it's not common, so again, so it's not for them, and then so it is generational. But there's just certain things that you don't bring up. You don't, the notion of bringing your whole self to work, there are limits to that.
For sure. Yeah. I again, this reminds me of a story. Everything either reminds me of a story or a song. So this is mid 90s, again, Goldman. A lot of women in the analyst program that I was in, junior level. And even back in the 90s, it was skirts and dresses, which meant pantyhose.
That's right, yes.
And I remember the first woman who went out on a limb and took a risk and wore a pantsuit. And by the way, sharp pantsuit, pinstripe, whatever.
Yep.
Got berated by a senior woman. I never want to see you wear pants in this office again. It wasn't that long ago. I'm just thinking about sort of the generational differences and how far we've come, that like we couldn't wear a pantsuit, and now we're all, people are wearing hoodies and yoga clothes to work.
Yeah. Not my thing. I have a huge wardrobe that I'd love to resuscitate, but not here, especially not working from home.
Yeah. All right. So I think that we have covered a lot of ground today. Yeah. Is there anything else? Is there anything I neglected to ask you that is important to share with the audience of Leadershifters today?
I think I just want everybody to take a breath and just sort of exhale and let's get grounded and find, I get up and meditate every morning. So that's the first thing I've done for myself this morning and every morning.
Yep.
And I want people to just focus in on what can you be doing? You know, what can you do? What can you say to someone to express and extend grace, to ask for another level of understanding, to just appreciate and walk in their shoes for just a moment? Someone who's not like you.
Yep.
That to me is kind of where we need to start and get back to some of just a sense of humanity and kindness and goodness and grace. And I know that that sounds very sort of airy-fairy, but know that I'm a hard-charging executive from way back.
Yeah.
I am a fierce warrior, but at the same time, I understand that this really comes from a deeply personal space. And I actually think that's why we're encountering this whole COVID situation now. If I look at it on a meta level, I believe that the universe is forcing us to go within and to really check ourselves and to get comfortable. So I would use this as an opportunity to do that for yourself, for the benefit of the organizations that you're associated with, for the benefit of the rest of society, and for your families.
Yep. It's like, be the change you want to see, right?
Yeah, be that.
And you're so right. It's like having empathy and treating people with humanity is not weak. It's actually the ultimate form of strength,
Isn't it?
right? To be able to suspend your own judgments and assumptions and stories and have empathy for someone you don't know or don't know what their experiences have been. It's a strength.
Yeah.
And
there's so much power in that. And that's where I derive my power, frankly. And it's not power over anyone. It's power and confidence and calm and peace in myself.
Yes.
And the strength to go on and to say what I say, to do what I do for the benefit of my son, for the benefit of, you know, others that I care about in my life. And I care about our civilization. I actually do. I know that sounds real, but I think we're at a critical time where we got to get it right. We need to wake up and understand why this is happening. Go to root cause in yourself and on a meta level and say, I need to be part of this change because it's going to matter for all of us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for adding that note to the end, because that really is the most important thing. A company can do all the things we talked about today, you know, and have all the, you know, have improved the infrastructure to have more diversity and more acceptance of opinions and all that sort of stuff. But you could still have individuals who haven't done that inner work, and they're gonna, you know, they could spoil the whole soup or in the experience for everybody else. So it is critical, leader shifters. And I know if you're watching this, you do your own work, because that's so much of what we talk about is getting your own shit together first.
I love it. That's right.
Before you do the rest of it. Well, Ginny, this was such a privilege to have you on the show. Thank you so much for all of your insights. If people want to reach you or get your book, what's the best way to do that?
GinnyClarke.com, GINNYCLARKE.com. Book is on Amazon. Podcasts are available on all the different platforms, and you can find the listing for them on my site as well.
Excellent. Ginny Clarke with an E on the end for extraordinaire.
You're so wonderful, Janie. Thank you.
Thank you. And leader shifters, thank you for joining us today. I hope this was helpful. I know we didn't exactly go in a linear order, but that's sort of how I roll. But I think you got all the nuts and bolts of why this has to start at the senior most level of the organization, and why it's not just about window dressing and checking boxes, that you have to really do your work, do the needs analysis within your organization, change the way you recruit, get better at assessing competencies and hiring and promoting and developing people based on that and based on where they want to go, and bring it into all the other parts of the organization. And we promise you, not just the research out there, we promise you that financial results will improve when you have more diversity of human being and thoughts and opinions, and people are kinder and more empathetic with each other. So with that, thank you for joining us. Until next time.